Hi everybody, today I talked with Dan Gookin. Dan is probably one of the most prolific content creators and technical writers this planet has ever produced. He has written over 100 books, probably a whole lot more if you want to count his updated editions, which are often significant rewrites. He's also the creator of the For Dummies series of books. He had this radical, unheard of, controversial idea that technical writing should be fun, should be playful, it should not be condescending to the reader. The author's personality should shine through. These are all things we take for granted today, but they were almost unheard of when Dan was pitching his earliest ideas for the first couple of books in the series. And the rest, given the influence that For Dummies books have had and its popularity, the rest is just history. And on a more personal note, his writing style was a huge inspiration for me, and some of his earliest books live rent-free in my head as perfect examples of what technical writing should be. This is going to be a really fun chat, so stick around. Dan, it is great chatting with you, and I have an introduction where I talked a little bit about, why I'm chatting with you and so on, but I've been reading your books for a very long time. Actually, your book was one of the first ones I read when I was very young and just getting to learn more about computers. And that got me into, of course, technical writing and the whole world that came from there. So just want to say thank you for doing all the things you've done.
Well,
And
welcome.
and then I want to just kind of start with at the very beginning. The same question I like to ask all the people I chat with on this is, how did you get started? In your case, what came first? A love for writing or a love for technology?
Well, it was writing first. I wanted to be a writer. So went to school, wanted to be a writer, write books, write science fiction and all that stuff. And for a long time, I was writing articles, short stories, and kind of trying to do novels. And I was getting really good connections with some magazines to where the editor would actually personally email me back, or actually it was writing back then. They would send me a letter and say, this is good, but we need something more along the lines of this. And then there was a local magazine in town in San Diego where I grew up, and it was called The Byte Buyer. And they were looking for people to write computer articles for them. And I had a computer and I like to write. So I figured I would write an article about computers. And I did. And so I was first published in that magazine in April of 1984. And they liked what I did. So I kept doing more for them. And eventually I became the editor of that magazine. I also spent time working at a computer book publishing house. So I ghost wrote quite a few how-to computer books. And that's kind of where I started to learn how the art of writing to a beginner was. And so learned that you had to be informative and you had to have humor. I also loved Mad Magazine when I was a kid. So I tried to combine the two, and I tried to sell an idea for years about a beginning computer book, something that would be friendly to people and approachable and say what they needed to learn about computers, because none of the other books were doing it. And the publishers didn't want to publish a beginner's book because they said beginners didn't buy books. And I said, well, they don't buy books because you don't write books for beginners. And eventually we just hit upon DOS for Dummies, which was a publisher approached me with the idea. And I said, well, I already have an outline for a book like that. And we just melded the two, and the rest is history. It exploded. So that's where I came from. That's the 3-minute version.
Yeah, I want to dive into some of these details first. But so 1984, not
Yeah.
many people had computers back then. It
No.
wasn't until like maybe even 10 years later, where even like some of your first videos, I think you did an interview for one of the local news stations where
Yes.
you talked about, what you should look for in a computer. And there was actually a picture, I think, of you by the poolside on a laptop. It was like 1991. So I'm like, okay, you were way ahead of the curve, even for people who were ahead of the curve at the time. So what got you into getting using computers in the early 1980s?
Well, it was so at college, they had a computer, they had a VAX, and so there were terminals all over the place for the computer science kids. And then I found out that anyone could use the computers, any student had access to the computer system, and that there was a word processor on there. And I'm a writer, and I had typewriters that I would go through, and I would break them because I would type so fast, or I would get angry or whatever, and the typewriters would break. And I'm like, well, what I really want is a word processor. And I knew a lot of people around then who would say, oh yeah, writers are using word processors now. This is, because you can cut and paste on the screen. You can move words around. You can, back up and erase without having to use whiteout or, to erase the page or whatever. And I'm like, well, yeah. And at school, they also had Apple II computers, and they had word processors, WordStar on them. And I was, well, that's what I want as a writer. So I bought the first computer as a tool to write with. Now the guy in the Apple store was pretty rude to me. He wouldn't help me, so I didn't buy an Apple. I went to a Radio Shack, and the guy there was nice, so I bought a TRS-80. And I actually have the ancestor to one of them is right back there. I used to have that computer was my writing computer for the longest time, and so I would write on the computer. But the problem is being a cook in a restaurant, I couldn't afford to buy a complete word processing system, so I only bought a computer, and it didn't even have disk drives. So I'm sitting there with this thing that I just paid a lot of money for, and I'm going, okay, so what can I do with it? Well, it came with a book. And the book was like, learn to program your computer. Now, I didn't touch any of that in college because I thought it involved a lot of math, but it actually doesn't really because the computer does the math. And so I started reading this book on programming, and I'm like, hey, this isn't that hard. It's kind of easy. So while I was waiting to finish the rest of my word processing system, I was playing with the computer. And then for my birthday, my mom bought me a modem. Now, this is kind of weird because, I mean, my mom's from that generation, and, they don't know how to use smartphones or anything. And she went to Radio Shack and said, what can we get as, a peripheral? And she got me a modem. So I'm online. In 1982, I'm online and going around and chatting with people on what were called bulletin board systems back then. And that was pretty fun. So I got to know computer nerd friends and get to know other programmers and stuff as I was learning how to program. And it was kind of fun. And then, of course, it just the writing ended up tending to the computer direction because I could explain computer things in a manner that people would understand. And it just kind of blossomed from there.
So when you talk about how your writing blossomed from that person point of view, depending on what source I'm looking at, you have anywhere from like over 150 to 200 books that you published over that period of time. How do you manage that?
Well, it's not that hard because if you actually look at the unique titles, and I can bring them up over here because there's a difference between having, writing. God, I don't know what my number is currently. I will tell you in just a second. But when you write for technology, you're rewriting a lot. So if I can just grab a book off the shelf. So we have PCs for Dummies, and this is they call this the 13th edition. And so what happens is, as you write about technology, of course, technology changes. So this version of PC for Dummies does not cover floppy drives, but the first version did. And the first version covered DOS, which is no longer used as an operating system. So as they keep changing the computers, you have to keep updating the books. So a lot of my books are redos. So 13 versions of PCs for Dummies. That's really one book that's been updated in various editions 13 times. So is that 13 books, or is that one book? So there's actually the number of unique titles that I have. So one-off books is about 68. So, and most of those a lot of them are programming books, but a lot of them are on technology that doesn't really exist anymore. So, older books on Excel and Windows, and I did a computer dictionary, did a book on memory management back when that was a thing in the 1990s. So those are all the unique titles, but the total number of titles, let's see if I can get what the current number is 175. So that's counting, if you count each time a book came in the mail and they said, well, here's the latest edition of your book, then it's 175, which does mean that I've actually, published that many books, but it also means that a lot of them are rewrites. So, you go through and you say, hey, here's the new version. That's really a new book, but is it?
I mean, I got introduced to your work from PCs for Dummies. One of the first books I read was PCs for Dummies. I forget what edition it was. My Amazon history goes all the way back to like 97 or 98.
Cool.
But I'm guessing this is back when I probably bought it at Barnes & Noble itself. Because, every weekend my parents just take me to Barnes & Noble, and they'd be getting coffee. It was like a thing back then.
Yeah.
I'd be like, jumping between video game books and technical books and so on. But of course, the PCs for Dummies book was like the one I read. I was like, I had to buy this. This is actually really good. And I remember like, what I really liked about it were the jokes in it. Because, I was a kid and like some of the humor was perfectly aligned to me. And I don't mean as a disrespect to you in any way. Like, I really liked the kind of humor in it. Like there's something about, I think one that always struck me, and I try to find it today if I can find the quote for it. It was really about like, like something about the Intel Pentium and it was at the Oracle at Delphi, like using all those terms from back then that happened to use very specific names of companies and technologies from that era. I was like, it's a core memory for me because even now, like, I don't have the context for it. My memory probably completely fudged it up extremely, but I know in an attic somewhere at my parents' house, that book is there. I can know exactly where it is from that. And it always was like fascinating thing to me. And so when I got started into writing, because similar reasons, I was into animation and graphics, and people would ping me about, hey, how do you do this? And email was no longer scalable. I started publishing on the blog, I was like, started in 1998, essentially. I was in middle school, starting to blog and so on. And so it's always like, I'm like, I'm going to make mine just as funny as the stuff that Dan writes, because it's just much, adds a human connection to it, as opposed to all the boring stuff that I saw from everyone else. And so that was really fun there. But I did, partly in preparation for what we were doing here, I bought a more recent version of PCs for Dummies, like a couple of weeks ago, and that was very different. So I realized like it's not, it's the same book, but to me it was a complete rewrite in a certain sense. So it's like over the period of time, whatever was book A, this is a brand new book in its own way. And I'm pretty sure there are probably brand new versions of it in the middle between the 20 or 30 years since the first time that book came out. So I think in that case, even though you're being humble and saying it's not a full rewrite, I think it is a whole new book. Just the title happens to be the same there.
It's easier to write because you know what you're going to write about. So you have the book there, like you said. But things change, the technology changes, and I don't like to reuse old material. I try to keep it fresh. It's hard because sometimes they want the book so fast that it's like, I really don't have time to think of something really clever or funny. So I do try to keep the humor up in there because it should be fun. It should be entertaining. Back in the day, you'd read a computer manual or a computer book, and the examples were really dry and boring. And I'd be like, oh, and they still are. I mean, I have a book on SQL programming. And, here's a database that's a collection of users, and it's boring. And so I'm always looking for things that, that I can do that's more entertaining and fun, that someone may, if someone's looking at it and they actually look a little deeper, they may say, oh yeah, there's humor here. That something's funny. It's outrageous. And they were a lot more funny back in the early days. The publisher gave me a lot more latitude to write some silly things in there. So like the original version of WordPerfect for Dummies, which I think is the best book I've done. And that was back in 1992. That was like, it had a lot of stuff in there that I would get in trouble for today. I mean, it's nothing that's offensive, but it was just silly stuff that was like, I mean, some of it, I got email from a guy who said, I am reading a computer book on the subway in New York and laughing out loud, and people are looking at me like, what's wrong with me? Because it was funny. I tried to make it that entertaining, informative, of course, first, but entertaining. So, I mean, the section in DOS for Dummies on recovering a deleted file, I mean, obviously there's no humor in there. It's just like, get the file back. They don't want to read a joke first. They want to get the file back. And then after the file's back, then I can tell a joke. So, that's kind of the way I would do it. But never really tried to put any humor in there. In fact, the humor usually comes during the second draft. So I write the first draft, and then the second draft, I can actually think of silly things to do, which is a lot easier because to me, it's easier to make fun of something than it is just to start out to be funny.
That makes a lot of sense. How were you able to convince your earliest publisher to actually take a bet on this more humorous take on writing, given that historically, at least my understanding of it is like, the publishing industry is very traditional. They don't like to change too many things up a whole lot. And especially back then where you had a handful of players who controlled a large part of the distribution, it was tricky to break in there because, it's hard to print, ship, store, keep the rats from eating all the books from warehouses and so on. And so how did you pull that off?
Yeah, that was, I still say this day, I say that, book publishing is a 18th century business that thinks that it's in the 21st century, but they're an old, stodgy, that's the way they do things. And it was at a conference. There used to be a computer book convention where all the publishers and authors would come, and it was in San Diego. And so I was talking at the time, I'd written about a dozen computer books, and I was giving a talk on, the author's perspective or whatever it was. And I said, one of the things I don't like about books is that when I write a book, I try to make it fun and entertaining and creative, but yet a lot of these publishers do what I call, they take the book and they put it over a creativity magnet. And so you have all this good stuff in your book, and the magnet just sucks it all out. And you're left with a dry, boring computer book. And I said, I hate that. And I was actually referring to a publisher called Cybex, and I had just written a book for them, and I forget what it was about, some subject. And the editor kept saying, I mean, he actually sent me an email, and he said, can you stop putting these jokes in your book? Because I just have to edit them out. And the same thing happened when I would work with Microsoft Press, which I love Microsoft Press, and I had a great relationship with them. But they would do the same thing. You can't. They actually told me once. They said, you can't put this thing in there about cops and donuts because it's not going to translate into German. And I'm like, why? That was their reason for pulling the joke out. And so I'm complaining about this stuff. And in the audience is this guy, Mac McCarthy. He is the editor in chief of IDG Books, which had just started out. I mean, they'd maybe done 6 books. And he was the guy who was looking for an author for DOS for Dummies. And so he said, hey, I want to take you out to lunch. So we went to lunch at the hotel. And he said, I have an idea for a book. And we're looking for an author to write it. And I want to write a book that has personality and is fun and all this stuff. And I said, well, I'm your author and I have the book. It's, I called it The Idiot's Guide to DOS. He called it DOS for Dummies. I sent him the outline. And from then on, we actually changed the entire computer book publishing industry because all of a sudden those other publishers like Cybex and Microsoft and the rest of them, they were all looking for books that had humor in them. Suddenly that became important. Now, the publishers would say, we want a book with attitude, which I think is dumb. And I said, no, you want a book with personality. We read these books, all our favorite authors that we have out there, if it's Stephen King or whoever, you generally read them because they're very lively reads. They have personality in there and you can identify with the characters. And I'm like, we can put the same stuff into computer books. You just got to let the author express their personality in there and find good authors and good writers who will do it. And they actually did. I mean, there were lots of guys, Andy Rathbone, Deke McClellan, or I forgot if I messed up his last name. Everyone calls him Deke. And a bunch of other good authors who had great senses of humor and could write really well and express ideas. And they all put together all these For Dummies books and they just sold like crazy. Oh, David Pogue was another one who, great sense of humor and sense of fun too. And that absolutely came across in the book. And so these books, Mac for Dummies and Windows for Dummies and PCs for Dummies and DOS for Dummies, they all became tremendously popular because the people out there who were bored to death with the old books suddenly loved the new books. It's like, now I finally have a computer book that I can read. It's entertaining, it's informative, and it keeps me going so that I'm not like just looking at chapter 6. That's all I want. So
yeah, I think the enthusiasm of the writer kind of just oozes out because in many places, if you look at real world teaching as well, the material can be dry and boring, but if the teacher is excited and like makes the material engaging, you can get you can by osmosis essentially get better at understanding the material because it's addictive. And I think the personality added to these books made some of this material that much more useful because yes, it's boring, but it's explained in a way where I can tell that the person who's writing it cares about the material greatly, as opposed to just droning on and on about something.
Yeah, and when you find a book like that, it's like, yeah, I like this guy, and I've done that several times. I bought mini books by an author who I enjoy, technical books, and I think that's what really set the industry apart. And of course, it only lasted a few years because then they realized that it didn't really matter what was in the book, and they just kept printing more and more of them, and and kind of diluting the content, which is just, it's capitalism. What can you expect? But I've always tried in my own books to keep up the interest level and to make them fun. In fact, I just got a comment. I updated my Word book. So there's a new version of Microsoft Word coming out. And the editor wrote me back and said, wow, you really make books fun. I really like reading the books. And I'm like, well, thank you. Take time and you put thought into it and you try to do clever little things to take a topic that otherwise is kind of boring and make it interesting.
Yeah, and the nice thing with the humor as well is that even if you know the material really well, you just want to read it because you just want to see what the humorous take on the material is going to be like. I definitely remember reading some pieces, that's actually the For Dummies books, not because I didn't know how to use this product, but because I just wanted a light read on an airplane or a train, and I just wanted to see how the humorous take on it would actually be. Because, I'm a geek. I love technology things in general. And so getting reinforcement on the same material I know, but from a different take on it was totally fine with me. So I think from a business point of view, it was probably a really good decision as well.
Oh yeah, and getting a belly laugh from a book when I'm reading something about like Photoshop or something, and all of a sudden they have you do something, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, that's so funny. It's It's like, thank you for entertaining me instead of just telling me what it is, step A, B, C. No, no, no. I mean, I want to have fun too. It's like, let's make learning fun. So,
And the For Dummies books were also interesting in that the design was very different as well. Like if you saw a collection of books on the book aisles at libraries or in bookstores, they stood out, the yellow and the black and so on. Do you have any insight into how that came about?
yeah, Mac McCarthy again. He did research and he found out that the two opposing colors that most attract the human eye are yellow and black, and that if you put this is why caution signs are yellow and black, because psychologically or cognitively we react to those colors. They're very strong, and so he decided to make the book yellow and black. He was the one who added that. Now, originally they don't have them anymore, which shows again how they're kind of like tamping down on the humor a bit. Is they all had cartoons in them, which I didn't like the cartoons, but people love the cartoons. They love the little icons. They love the little dummies. Man, that was another thing that came around. When I was writing DOS for Dummies, about 2/3 the way through the book, they came back and said, "We want icons in the margin," and I'm like, "What?" And so they sent me a book to show me what the icons look like. And I'm like, okay. So I came up with the four basic For Dummies icons: the technical stuff, the tip, the warning, and remember. And the technical stuff one has what they call now the Dummies Man on it. And the Dummies Man is actually a caricature of the guy, the graphic artist who designed those icons. His name is Peppy. And if you meet him in real life, he looks like the Dummies Man. So that was basically him. And I got to meet him once when I was visiting in San Francisco, and he was just really funny. He was really surprised too at how well the books were doing, and I'm like, well, that's you, and he's like, yeah, that was me. I drew myself as the technical nerd guy, and I thought that's really fun. So
That's great. So every writer, it's a process on how you go from an idea in your head to putting it down into the screen or on paper. What's your process like?
Well, usually, so I always start with an outline. Everything has to have an outline. So you start putting ideas down in an outline, and the more you flood your ideas there, the more you can organize. Microsoft Word helps you do that. So you start promoting and demoting topics. You shuffle them up and down. You move them left and right to try to see how to fit things together. And the more you do that, the better the final book's going to be, because then that helps you build the whole picture. Because everything to me, everything always starts out scattered. So I'm always like, oh, I got to talk about this and this and this and this and this, and move all over the map. And then, of course, as you're working on the ideas, more ideas pop into my head, which again is why I have to have an outline. In fact, for that one book for Word Perfect for Dummies, the outline on that book was so complete and so thorough that when I sat down to write it, I wrote it in 3 weeks. It took no time to write it because it was all done in the outline. I just had thought about it so much and how I wanted to present the information. The other thing is just to leave the computer room. All my life, I've been a member of a gym, so I always go to the gym, or I go on a walk, or I do something to get out and to free my mind so that the ideas will come popping in again. Because as a writer, sometimes it's very frustrating to, it's like, oh, I need to think of a good metaphor here. I need to think of something to compare this to so that someone will understand it better. And I can't do that when I'm stale. So it's like, okay, so even though I know I'm on a deadline and I have to get work done, I'm going to leave the house. I'm going to go walk around the park, do a couple of laps, go down to the river, whatever, throw rocks in the river, because I know that once I take my mind off it, the idea is going to rush into my head and I'll be like, yes. And then I have to go back. So that happens a lot. And that's really the source of inspiration is to, you have to leave. It's like the guy sitting at his typewriter, he's off in his cabin in the woods and he's doing that and he's got his coffee and whatever, and he's trying to think of an idea. Nothing's going to come to you. You have to go out and you have to do something else, take your mind off it. It's a left brain, right brain thing. So I do have a wood shop. And so sometimes when I'm really frustrated, I'll go out and try to make something out of wood. It's like, okay, making another birdhouse or whatever. And then all of a sudden the idea comes in. It's like, yes, back to the computer. So that's how I do it.
Yeah, I think letting your mind wander is something that almost all articles and research on what makes creative people creative comes up all the time.
Mm-hmm. And it's also and some people don't have that. So my mom wanted to be a writer. She doesn't have that. She's very focused. She's a very linear person. She thinks A, B, C, D, E. And I can be really scatterbrained at times. I can just hop around, which again is why I do an outline, because if my brain's hopping around and I'm just writing down a list of ideas, at some point in time, I can switch gears and go, okay, now how do we organize this? What comes first? So if I got to talk about this, they already need to know this. So this comes up here, and oh, they all already need to know this before they know that. And again, that's how you build and present the information. So you're not. And I've read computer books like this where you're reading along, and on page 3 it says, now this, just to find out how to do this, go to page 16. And I'm like, well, why do I need to go up there when it should be right here? It's those kind of things.
It's not a choose your adventure book in that sense. It's really
Exactly.
designed to be a reference and linear.
Exactly.
Yeah. When you have an idea, like doing something not in front of your computer, and you want to jot it down, what do you use to do that?
Well, a lot of tools. I used to, back in the old days, I would get on my cell phone and I would leave myself a message. So I would phone. I had a separate cell phone and, of course, an office phone, and I would call the office phone and I would say, "This is what you need to do," and so leave myself a phone message. Now I can dictate into my phone, or I'll bring up an app, a writing app like Google Docs, and I'll write something down. But most of the time, what happens is it sticks in my head, and that's really cool. So the other day, I was thinking of of a something that I'm writing now, which has to do with shapes. So putting shapes in, creating shapes, circles, squares, those kind of things. And all of a sudden it popped into my head, getting into shape. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I can do puns. So I would go ahead and just start thinking of all these shape puns and then put them in the book as much as I could and as much as made sense. So pretty much now the idea comes in and it's really heavy, so it sticks around with me. But when I'm thinking and I'm like, oh yeah, I need to do that, gotta write it down. I mean, because sometimes you'll be walking around, come back into the office, and I'll be like, yeah, what was that idea? I didn't write it down. Now I forgot. So there's that. And of course, with the new technology and everything, I mean, with cloud storage and stuff, it's really easy to keep all that stuff connected. So I don't have to worry about. I used to have a Palm Pilot before the phones got fancy, and so I would carry a Palm Pilot and I would write the ideas down on a Palm Pilot. But now I can write them down in a Google Doc. It's saved on the cloud. It's here on the desktop. So that made it a lot easier. But that's, yeah, you have to, because like I said, if I'm out wandering around and an idea pops into my head, I don't want to lose it.
Yeah. And are you also someone who, if you have an idea in the middle of the night, you just suddenly wake up, you can remember it when you wake up in the morning, or do you jot it down at that moment itself just so you don't forget it?
Usually when I wake up in the middle of the night, I'm screaming. And so those aren't really the ideas that I want to keep. Unfortunately, yeah, that hasn't happened in a while. It used to, though. And that's why I have a laptop by my bed. And the reason is so I can jot down the idea if I have an idea. And that has happened. And it's like, here I am at 3:30 in the morning and the laptop lid is open and I'm writing down an idea. And that has happened a few times. So, but again, it's like in a Google Doc or somewhere, and it's just keeping it there. The other time is like, I'll be out, I'll be in a boring meeting, or it'll be a luncheon or something, and I'll have an idea, and then I can flip up my phone and put it in there really fast, and that's one way to keep it. And it's, yeah, but most of the time, the good stuff I won't forget. It's more of the random stuff. It's more of the, oh yeah, we should do that and that and that. It's like, nah, I have to write this down or I'll forget that.
Yep.
So.
So end to end, how long does it take for you to go from starting your outline to getting a book ready to send to your publisher?
Depends on the deadline. So there's been some that there was one that they gave me a week to do, and that was a terrible version of a book that was just a week long update. But they were just pressuring me so hard to get that book out. But usually, I give myself about 2 to 3 weeks to do a good outline, and that's working on it at least an hour every day, building it and getting it to that point where it's down to the almost the paragraph level of what's going to be covered. Because then if I can get that done, then the book may take me 6 weeks to write, and that's it. And so, and I can write them faster too. It depends on how much of a social life I want and whether I want to go outside that day. But yeah, just getting that done. It's also one of the biggest problems for people who don't work for themselves and don't understand how that works is you really have to have a sense of duty to show up and actually get the work done. I know a lot of people who've tried to work for themselves and they're too distracted. They'll go off and they'll be like, oh, I should really clean this room right now. I got a couple of minutes. Or, they look outside and they say, wow, it's really pretty. I want to go outside and play with a dog or whatever. you have to say, okay, so this morning, like, good example, this morning, so I knew I had this event that we were going to be chatting here. And I said, okay, before I do that, I want to go do these 3 things. And I think I have enough time. So I went ahead and scheduled it so that I could get that done and then get this done. And then after this, I have a bunch of other stuff that I would like to get done. So I just set little deadlines, and I've been doing it so long that I can be successful at that. But I know how long it takes to write things. And the current book that I'm working on, which isn't due until January, I figured out in my head that if I can do maybe 5 or 6 pages every day, then I'll get that book done. So that's kind of my goal. If I can do that, if I can do more, it's even better. And then when I'm done with that, I'll go off and I'll do something else. So generally, I'm juggling several projects at a time, which also helps keep me fresh, because you don't want to get stuck and then say, well, I really need a break now. And that happened. Oh, I was under a deadline once, and they wanted a book like in 3 weeks. And I'm like, oh, so I'm going to have to work like every day, 10 hours a day to write this book. But then I found out after about 4 days of doing that, it doesn't work anymore. The brain's all clogged up. And so it's like, I definitely need to take a day off. And that's that refresher. That's getting out into nature. That's doing whatever, just leaving the scene. And then you come back all freshened up. So there is something to be said for taking a break every so often. And that's the way you do it.
Yeah, the example I often give when people ask, this question for me as well sometimes is like, and I think you probably can recognize is like, do you remember this defragmenter from back in the day, like this
Yes.
95 or 98
Yeah.
and so on? There are
Yeah.
moments where you're just seeing like, the pale teal color turn to a slightly darker one, slowly, one at a time is going like, man, this is
Yeah.
never going to get done. Now, why was I watching that? I have no idea. But the thing is that at some point though, it starts going like page after page. It's like full of gigantic blocks at any given time.
Yeah.
And my view is always that what you want to optimize for is those giant blocks coming in those large
Mm-hmm.
buckets, as opposed to like, focusing on it narrowly on this one word or something for like 8 hours, because you're going to make like very little progress. But if you took a break, had other things to kind of get your mind off of what you're working on, you can optimize for this large things, which in aggregate be a much faster way of getting things done, even though it may not look like to you at that moment that you're spending your time productively.
It's a marvelous analogy.
Yeah,
And
I have
it's so bad for if someone's watching and they aren't familiar with that. I would do that too. Watching the defrag, and you got this screen full of all these little dots and stuff, and they're twinkling and just moving just a little bit at a time. And I was like, yeah, I know it's working because it's doing something, but then at the end, it's like big chunks shuffling up and down, and of course, the result after suffering through that was that the computer was faster. Everything ran faster.
It did, and I even like fell for like installing like Norton System Works back in the day and doing that little optimized thing where it probably like deleted valid entries from the registry and like removed things that it needed from the startup. But I'm like, oh, it's so much faster the first time around. After 2 restarts, it goes bad again. Like, let me run it one more time to make it work. But the thing with defragmenting was like, I don't want to spend too much time on defragmenting specifically, but there'd be moments where you'd see like immovable region would come up. I'm like, why is the region immovable? Like, what's in there? It's everything in the disk is just like zeros and ones. Like, what is it about that? Those red, I think it was red squares. What,
Yes,
what is
that's
it about
right.
those things that cannot work? And is it safe for that other data to be right next to the immovable region? Like, that might be like, what if it's like, radioactive kind of thing? It's like emulating things that could like, infect other regions. If I have too many immovable regions, that's probably storage I can't use to install my games and do whatever I was doing. And so a lot of things, like I hate to say this, but a lot of my core memories were probably around like very mundane computer things and going like, why does it do these kind of things? And of course, my interest would never be like, okay, let me go dive into detail. I'm like, let me jump into something else instead.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Those were the days. And
those
of
were
course,
the
we
days.
didn't know.
I
We
think
didn't know anything.
no, and I forget. Well, I think Windows 98 had the defragmenter. I think it was Windows Millennium that removed it. I think at that point it had an automatic system optimizing thing where you just, you hit defragment, but you just see a progress bar. There's nothing to see anymore at this point. And then I think after that, when XP came out, it was done automatically behind the scenes. You never really, you had the defragmenting to make people like us probably feel like we're doing something productive, but the reality was it was always doing it behind the scenes without any active work from you.
And the file system has changed, so it's much more efficient. But back in the old days, I mean, that was a file system that was designed for a 10 megabyte hard drive, and so it was like, things got really sloppy fast, and now it's super efficient. And of
That's
course,
right.
with the NVMe drives and the
Yeah.
SDDs and everything, I mean, it's all so fast. It You don't even notice it anymore.
No, no, there was no like, scare stories about like going from fat 16 to fat 32 and like what may or may not happen at that time. And NTFS, just forget about that one. That would be like, you're like doing enterprise level things at that moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do think that a lot of people today just don't understand, like don't take for granted how easy it is to like just hit something and just have things work. Like, for me, like I lived in a small town in Tennessee at the time when I was like doing a lot of my computer things. And there's this moment where my US robotics modem, there were two competing standards, I believe. It was like one was by Lucent and one was by US robotics. And at some point the government said everyone must standardize on V90 as the option for it.
Mhm.
And then there was a little firmware update that we had installed from like a floppy disk. And then magically you now connected on a V90 thing. And I was in the back of my mind, I'm like, how in the world was that possible? You had like two competing standards that people either, you were either on camp A or camp B. Your identity was wrapped up around that, and the ISP you chose was wrapped up around that as well. Like, oh, I can't use that one. My modem will not work with this ISP, so I need to use the other one. And then this thing came up where you just like installed this thing that suddenly made all of it work. And now you're like, wow, I'm connecting at like 48.8 kbps. That's magical.
Yeah, it was crazy. Those were insane days. I mean, it's just. I think about that too. It was crazy, but now it all works.
It all worked exactly, and nowadays, I'm like, my friends is like, yeah, I have a Starlink portable thing. I'm gonna go hiking in the middle of the woods, and they put it on the ground like in 10, 15 seconds. There's a nice UI in the app, and it works magic. I'm like, wow, like even my physical fiber connection here may not be as good at times as what is available here, and that's like going to space and back. And so, technology's gotten pretty advanced. So that's why I always like found it very fascinating. I read your Pieces for Dummies book later. I'm like, wow, it changed a lot, because my memory of what it was back then and what your books were right now and how much it captured, the changes here. And like, yeah, I don't think anybody who read a book from you like 30 years ago would even recognize 90% of the material you're talking about right now, because it was so far ahead of its time and futuristic when we describe like, just the ability to like, hey, hit a button, your internet works, you have video and audio conferencing and things in real time. Like what we're doing right now would have been like unheard of for people back then. It's like,
well, live video I mean, that was not a thing.
It was exactly
too
right.
slow. I mean, there's images that we have now that we find on the internet and that we download were larger than a floppy disk, and I mean, 1.44 megabytes, and yet I mean, the other day I uploaded to the publisher 36 megabytes worth of stuff, and I can't imagine making 36 floppy disks and then sending that in the mail.
Exactly. Whenever I have to see it, whenever I see a file size in my inbox that's like more than like a few hundred kilobytes, my mind immediately goes back to like, wait, I only have 15 megabytes storage total in my entire email thing. I'm paying for that extra storage. The free one would have been like 1 megabyte or so on. It was like Lycos Mail or like Hotmail or something like that. And so I'm just like baffled at like how quickly this happens. And I spent some time talking to, I interview high schoolers from one of my college, my alma mater, and I often talk to them about like, technology and so on. And their mind starts off with like where technology is like right now. Whereas whenever I think about something, I always go back like 30 years from now and I gradually get to today. And I'm like, okay, now let's talk about what's going on right now. And so it's always fascinating seeing like how people's default experiences are shaped by modern technology as opposed to like what we had so many years ago.
And the people who just use phones or tablets as opposed to using computers. So and they think that, you design a website, it's going to say, hey, where's the mobile version? And it's like, mobile version? Yeah.
Exactly. We have like the whole responsive design thing where we have to design for something beyond like a 640 by 480 screen, or the whole idea of DPIs being like more than like like 72 was probably the one you always cared about. You never cared about anything beyond that. And then like looking back at like, especially when I look at my website stuff from like the late 1990s, and I'm like, yeah, this was like garbage right now, because it's like a top left corner of my screen. For some reason, this table is like taking up the entire page because I never tested anything else, because no one used anything beyond that particular one. So it's funny seeing how much the technology has evolved and how our behaviors have changed as well.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Yeah. Speaking of behaviors changing, writing has changed a lot from back then to now, especially how you write, how you market, and right to the internet, self-publishing, and video content, and so on. How are you able to navigate all that? Because I do know that you're creating videos. You also have instructional content on LinkedIn, so you definitely have your hand across both legacy publishing, but also like futuristic, modern, non digital media as well.
Yeah. So LinkedIn Learning basically, well, they do all the marketing and everything. So I provide the content. I've also provided my own content online, and you do have the online publishers. The key is marketing, and I'm dumb when it comes to marketing. So when it comes to the self-published books I have on Amazon Kindle, I subscribe to their marketing service and they market the books. So, you just type in, you say what the topics are and what some competing titles are, some interest, some search words. And then people who are looking for that, they'll, your book comes up and hopefully they buy it. And that's about all I do for marketing because I'm really dumb when it comes to marketing. I mean, traditional publishers, they do the marketing. I write the book, and that's pretty much how I've been doing it. I'm just kind of ignorant when it comes to all that stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's something I've always noticed is a big change, especially nowadays, is that the barrier for entry for someone to get a book published is fairly low. The traditional publisher path is still has some hurdles,
Oh,
but
yeah.
if you are good at marketing, you can bypass so many things. And I'm terrible at marketing as well, because that's like a full-time job in its own way, and also
Yeah.
requires you to kind of shamelessly self-promote. Which, if it's
Yes.
not in your personality to do that, it just feels a little bit uncomfortable, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe even like downright like not appealing in some ways as
Mm-hmm.
well.
Yeah, no, I don't like tooting my own horn. That's another thing. Went back in the '90s when we had bookstores all over the place. So I'd go visit a bookstore and my mom, and she'd go, "Oh, there's your book. Look, it's up there. This my son wrote this book and all this stuff." And I'm like, "Oh, Mom, why are you doing that?" But yeah, I don't. I just don't. One time I went into a bookstore and I found a bunch of my books and I signed them and put them back on the shelf. And I thought, well, this will be kind of cool. Whoever buys the book will get an autographed copy. But I mean, that's about all I ever did.
Yeah, it's I think the decline of bookstores in some ways is like makes it very difficult nowadays. Because if I go to the tech section of many bookstores
Mm-hmm.
now, it's tiny, and then the books
It's
that are
tiny.
there, I'm like, I talked to my publisher about it. Like, yeah, I would pay a lot of money to even be on that sections now because it's not like you can just be there. I'm like, yeah, this is we're in like canned goods and cereal territory
Yeah.
at this point. Where like to be able to be featured here, you're competing with essentially other products that are for the most part, substitutable goods.
Right, right, and it's always been that way. The thing is, the turnover is so strong. I mean, the computer books, they're only good for so long. Well, some of them have legs. Programming books always going to be good as long as the language isn't overhauled too severely. But yeah, some of the other books, they just they're it's a high turnover thing, and so I think the bookstores don't really want to take it because there used to be, like you said, you go to Barnes and Noble and it was awesome. There was a whole row of computer stuff, and you could look at if you whatever your topic you was, there were dozens of books there that you could look at and see which one you like the most. And now that's pretty much gone, and it's sad too because I mean I still buy computer books as references, and the online thing isn't the same. You can't really, I mean, you can look through some of the books, but you can't really see what it is you want to see. So but I think books still have a place. I just wish the publishers would respect the books a bit more. When they do like a dummies book, it's kind of like the paper quality is a little cheap, the cover is a little flimsy. If they would put a little bit more into it, if someone's going to buy a book, I think they'd be willing to pay a little bit more to have something that's going to last. So that's just my thought.
No, agreed. And the grayscale and the black text is never quite the same. It
Yeah.
looks a little bit fuzzy at times. And
Mm-hmm.
no, I completely agree with you on that because, I looked at some of the older books that I gotten many years ago. They were in like, three color or full color in some ways. And I'm like, okay, what was it about books back then that, ignoring inflation, the cost was very similar. Yet now the same books, you're lucky if the publisher's like willing to do a color copy version of it. It's like, we're going to do black and white
Yeah.
primarily. We
Mm-hmm.
maybe do three colors just because you're being a pain and bugging us way too much on it. But yeah, I think we kind of lost the appeal of books because when you giving an option of like you can read this book, it's black and white, probably not the highest quality, or you can visit the ebook version of it where it's like all in color. It
Mm-hmm.
makes it difficult for a consumer to kind of justify going like, no, I'll get the book version anyway, even if it's a more lousy experience. And I do think that, like you mentioned, if a publishers did a little bit more to make the physical books appealing, it'd be a more equal conversation. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, like the convenience of portable ebook readers like an iPad or a Kindle, but I also like this book here because I'm not sacrificing readability because I'm choosing this.
Exactly.
Oh man, we can talk forever about all of that. But also, I think one change I've noticed is that back then, if you want to learn about some computer topic, you either had to go to like a community college or or a course and actually learn from a human being, or
Uh-huh.
read books. Those are like at
Right.
least back then the big options. There were VHS tapes that, of course, on like how to do stuff that you can like buy series of and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But nowadays, you have a lot more competition. If you want to
Yeah.
learn something, like for me today, if I want to learn something brand new, I don't go for a book immediately. I just go to YouTube and be like, okay, what is the the
Mm-hmm.
best thing I can find very quickly to give me like a 3-minute overview to see like, do I want to go deeper into this?
Yeah.
How has that changed how your books are marketed and how your books are written and so on, knowing that there's another market here for this?
Well, I'm still writing to the person who's a linear learner who needs a book. I mean, I do have videos for doing stuff on the internet, and but again, I don't market that. And so no, I'm just looking for the traditional person who needs a book as a reference, wants to keep it handy, needs to have that thing. It's quicker, in my opinion, and I've done this before. It's quicker for me to look up something in a book than it is to try to find that one perfect video. Because as you know, as anyone knows who's looked it up, I mean, my latest example was lawn sprinklers. One of my sprinkler heads was acting weird, and so I wanted to find a video on how to fix it. And I think I must have looked at 20 of them, because you start and you look, and all of a sudden it's like, hey guys, good to see you again, subscribe and like my channel. And you're like, just tell me what I need to know. It takes so long to get that, and then to find the one guy who you can understand, who isn't holding the camera with one hand and trying to do it with the other, and it's just horrible. That's why I always say, no, I'm going to default to going to a book, because not only can I open the book like the one I just bought the other day, which is writing a C compiler. Not only can I open this book and leaf through it, I can mark up the book.
Yep.
I can draw in here. I can put a sticky note on here that says things, and then that's a reference that I can use for the future, so that when I have something like my Unix Power Tools book, and see it has all these marks in it, and it has like pages where there's like something in the page that says this is important, and notes written in the margins, because that's something I do that happens to be finding files. And so these are reasons why I have books, and I think there's other people like us who have that as well, who need that reference, who know that it's quicker for me to grab that book off the shelf and look at something that I've looked at before because I know it's in there, than it would be to start searching the videos and looking through and finding, oh wow, I have to watch even 3 minutes of this just to find that one thing that I've already written in the margin. So that's my philosophy.
No, very true. And I was reading a statistic a while ago that talked about the sale of bookshelves has been declining year over year for like decades. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, okay, I'd like to write because I just enjoy writing. And my style is I put my content for free on my website first, and then I put it into book form. It's like marketing, free marketing, and then, you kind of do this. Then I'm like, but why would anyone ever, if you buy a book, where are going to put it? If the bookshelves keep disappearing and people aren't using books anymore, to me, like these proxy metrics concern me. I have a 6-year-old daughter, for example, and she likes reading books, but for technical things, she's more comfortable with a touch screen than, a mouse and keyboard. And I'm like, yeah, that makes sense, because I didn't have a touchscreen until much later in my life, because it didn't exist until now. Whereas now the default is touchscreen, and I have my Apple MacBook Pro, which does not have a touchscreen. Her default thing is like, let me touch a screen to go what's going on. I'm like, actually, honey, it's not a touchscreen. You can't really touch it. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, why is it not a touchscreen? Like, is Apple not seeing the same data that we are seeing, that the world is moving into this kind of a world? And sometimes I wonder if you and I are probably like the last number of people in the world who still think about books and writing and things like that in the same way.
Yeah, it's still, what I would always tell people when I do an interview or just reference it, I would say, when the power goes out, you can still read a book. So, when the internet is down, I can still work because my references are all here. And that's why, it's important, because other people who rely on that stuff. Now, granted, that would be me too, because like you and everyone else, there are programs that I use like Adobe After Effects, and I don't know everything in that program. I actually don't think, if there was a book, it would probably be this thick. So I want to look at the one thing, how do I animate this? And then there is a couple of videos, and there's some great people up there who actually have a 2-minute video that shows you exactly how to do it. But all that's gone when the power's out or the internet is down or whatever. So there's still value in having a book. And then there's also value in that way of learning. And I've seen studies that will say that when you learn something by reading a book, you will retain it longer than when you learn something by watching a video. So I think there's magic there too.
Yep, and I think also like if you do what you're doing, so like annotating and taking notes as part of
Hmm.
what you're learning, you retain the knowledge even a whole lot more. And I think the ultimate one is if you can teach it back to somebody else, that's like the ultimate peak in
Right.
like you understanding a material really,
Hmm.
really good. Which
Yeah, the
in some ways the
insight.
motivation for me to learn random things is like if I write about it and teach people, that means that I fully understood it. And often while I'm writing it, I detect gaps in my knowledge, or I'm like, wait, why is it done this way? Like, let me actually
Hmm.
go back and explain this because if someone's reading it, they're going to be like, why is he explaining something that doesn't make any sense? And
Right.
so it's been a good motivating factor sometimes in just becoming better at something.
It's having that insight, and the insight is also how when I write, I like to do like a parable on something. It's like, you're trying to do this, this, and this, and now we're going to apply that same thing to what's going on in the computer, and then hopefully instill that insight into someone so they kind of get just a hint of what's really going on, as opposed to saying, do this random thing, and this random thing, and then it creates whatever it is you want to create. Well, they'll never understand it. All they know is that there's these steps they have to follow, and then they won't be able to handle it when the things don't work. But if you can tell them what's really going on behind the scenes, so here you're setting this up, you're putting these things together to build this thing that's a machine that's going to do this for you, and then finally produce the result, then they can understand it, and then that's when they become a better user, as opposed to someone who's just, like in the early days when I wrote DOS for Dummies, and people would literally have a flower petals of sticky notes around their monitors that would have the instructions for everything they needed to do. It's like, okay, so I need to send this over to accounting. So there it is. So I need to type that, and then that, and then that. And of course, if it didn't work, they're stuck. They got the instructions there, and I typed exactly what it said, and it's not working. I mean, that was the person I was writing DOS for Dummies to. It's like, look, here it is, and now it's going to be in a book, so you can free all your sticky notes from the monitor.
Speaking of After Effects, a lot of your videos have animations in them. Did
Yeah,
you create the animations yourself, and did you create them in After Effects?
I did it, yeah, in After Effects most of the time. I mean, originally it was Flash. They had Adobe Flash, and that was kind of a silly program. And so some of the early videos used Flash, but which I would just capture. So it wasn't like Flash animation; it was recorded. And then After Effects could do all kinds of miraculous things, which is fun. And so that's why I do some of the animations. And granted, I'm pretty sure that the way I'm using it is awkward and wrong, and that there's probably a better way to do it for someone who has that insight and it says, oh, why are you doing that? You should do this. And here's the way you keyframe it and all this other, pre-comp and all these technical terms. And I'd be like, okay, but so some of it would take a long time to do, but it was fun. And see, I like stuff like that. It keeps me interested. So,
Yeah. Yeah, same. And I have, for me, when I started using Adobe Premiere, I realized I was
mhm,
getting to that point where back in the day when I had more time and more patience, I would actually want to go deep into something fully, learn everything inside and out, and then go
mhm,
from it.
yeah.
But I realized I'm getting to that point now where when I get to new technologies, I'm like, I don't care about why it does a thing or how it works. I just want to know the bare minimum needed to get this particular job done, which in my case is auto captions. Just give me
Yes.
auto captions. And I don't know why I'm clicking this button. I do know if I click this button incorrectly or maybe I'm looking at it the wrong way, things
Mhm.
break. So I'm just going to blindly copy and paste what I've learned and do things, which I remember back in the day, I was like, I'm never going to be that person. I'm never going to be that person who's going to like look at some reference manual, do that thing blindly, and then memorize those steps without deeply understanding what's going on behind the scenes as part of doing this. Lo and behold, I'm now that person for a certain class of apps where I don't really care how this works. I don't care about,
Mhm.
color profiles and things. There's an auto button. I'm gonna hit the auto button. I'm gonna just change some
Yeah.
fonts here and there because I know I get font sizes. That's it. I'm not gonna do anything more. I'm not gonna touch it. I'm gonna hit the button. I'm gonna walk away because I'm gonna be sitting here. I might break something, and I've gotten to that point. And I wonder if you ever get. You seem to be far more interested in like a variety of topics. Like for example, I want to talk a little bit about you learning about C
Yeah.
programming and talking a lot about the C language and so on. So
Yeah.
I feel like you're definitely still in the area where you're still excited by new technology and still
Mhm.
want to go deep into all of these things.
I try as much as I can, and there was, I use Premiere too, and some of the tech stuff in there would frustrate me until it finally dawned on me. I finally gained the insight as to what was going on, because it was like, wow, what is this doing? Why is it being stubborn? Why doesn't it do it the way I want to do it? And so I had to get into the frame of mind of whoever the programmer was or whatever their audience was, and say, yeah, okay, so I get it now. And then once that clicked, and there's kind of if you use a lot of Adobe stuff, there's kind of a similar thread between all their programs, and once you figure out kind of how things work, then you can guess a little bit, and that's just from using the program for so long. But I still have I know there's a lot more stuff that goes on in these programs than I am doing. And that, because I mean, I'll still look at you search up how to do something in After Effects or Premiere, and then on YouTube, you're getting more and more videos along those lines. And some of them I'll look at and it'll be like, wow, you can do that, you know? And not only that, you can, the video is only 2 minutes long. So it's something that's really simple to do. And it's like, that's really cool. So that's why I think, back in the old days, back in the 1990s, it was possible for you and I to know everything and to figure all it out. Today, it's just impossible. So you do as best you can. And of course, if you really want to learn it, you just get a book, and the book will hopefully help you and get through that. But yeah, it's tough to be able to. I mean, I would never say I know everything about everything, because there's always someone who's going to come up and say, "Hey, here's a trick," and I'll be like, "Wow, I'm embarrassed. I don't know that."
Yeah,
So
and the fear I often have is that, am I spending a lot of time learning the right tool for this right job? I have an
yeah.
Adobe subscription, so I have Premiere, I have After Effects, all these tools come along with it. Whereas some of my more, graphically video-oriented friends, they use Final Cut Pro, and I'm like, wait, am I missing out here? Am I learning the wrong thing as a part of it? And then you look at what a lot of content creators use today. You have a variety of other tools that are being created. You have Camtasia, you have CapCut, you have like 20 different things that you watch the videos from. Like, wow, this is much easier to use. Should I be learning that instead? You know what? I'm just gonna, like those kind of the this is like the paralysis of choice in some ways. I feel like back then there weren't really too many things out there. You had Macromedia, Adobe. They both had very different styles and how they cared about presenting UI in some ways. I was very much a team Macromedia person when I was using Flash
Mm-hmm.
for things. And once Adobe bought them, I found that things changed. The tooltips were different. The
Mm-hmm.
things were different. But luckily, I wasn't doing too much of that kind of work at the time anyway. So I was like, it's fine that I don't know much about how these things work. Whereas today, you have small one-person developer shops who are able to use more modern technologies and things to not have to work at a low level. There are APIs that exist for so many things, as opposed to you having to reinvent what it's like to capture video from like your hardware using like very basic primitives. And I was like, there's an API in whatever language you're doing. It's like, write a couple lines of code, you now have video in your application. And you're like, wow, this makes it so much easier, which also means that there are many more options for you to choose from on how to do this.
Yeah, it's. I think that part's fun to me. I enjoy doing that part. That's hacking.
So, shifting over to C programming,
Sure.
a lot of your books, you've been programming for a long time. I think you mentioned like you started programming, early on, like as part of like before you got your word processing system set up
Yeah.
and so on. But a lot of your books early on were less about programming, but more about just general topics. So was it something that in your background, you always like to just program for fun, but you always chose to write about things that were, things that people at that time were mostly interested in?
Yeah, and you're going to write about what's going to sell. And so, I mean, my start at the computer book publishing house was writing programming, basic programming, and I knew basic pretty well because that was all I could do on my computer for a while. So I bought a lot of books on basic, and I wrote a lot of programs and figured out how to do a lot of things. Now, basic's slow, so once I figured out it was slow, I was like, well, what's faster than this? And then I took up assembly language, did the same thing, bought books on learning assembly language, and programmed a lot of stuff in assembly. And then picked up C after that because assembly is very slow as far as development's concerned. Programs are really fast, very tiny, very fast, but C is kind of a midway in between. So I picked up C and learned that. And of course, I'm still learning it because there's just a lot to know and a lot to learn, and a lot of good stuff out there. So it's always been a process, and I enjoy it. To me, programming is very relaxing. It's fun to think of a problem or to find a problem online. Like I've always loved, way back when I was a kid, my mom had the Time Life series on computers. And one of the problems that they presented in the early days, programming problem, was called the Knight's Tour, which is where you take a knight on a chessboard, and the knight can move to every single square on the chessboard without hitting the same square twice. And that is a computer problem. You can figure that out. And so after years of admiring that when I was just a kid, I finally coded it. I said, maybe I should think about coding the Knight's Tour, and just did it for fun. Now I put it up. I have a blog. I have a C For Dummies blog. So I finally put up the result on the blog and showed the little animation of the knight moving around the chessboard, hitting every square and never hitting a same square twice. And to me, that was incredibly satisfying because I just did it on my own. I'm like, well, how would I do this? Okay, figure out, well, we need recursion or something. We'll just kind of figure it out. And then figuring out how to do it for different size chessboards because it works, there's a minimum size, but you could have a chessboard that's, 200 squares and the knight can still go all the way around and never hit a same square twice because that's the algorithm. And so it was, for me, it was really fun. And that's why I do it, because I enjoy it. So I'm nuts, but I pass along that knowledge to other people. So I'm happy to tell other people how it works and explain it in a way that's easy to understand. Because back in the days for programming, they were really reluctant to help beginners out. I mean, it was kind of like a protect your turf type thing. And so I'm not like that. I'm like, no, I'll show you how to do it. And here's the insights and here's what you're supposed to do to make this happen. And so that's always been fun for me.
Yeah. So what motivates you to keep writing?
Money. So, well, I enjoy doing it. I'm doing more online stuff, which I really enjoy. I really enjoy doing the online stuff and, YouTube videos and stuff like that. To me, that's more exciting than writing, which is, like I said a lot earlier, that's an 18th century technology. It's old and it's stodgy. And I still enjoy doing that. But today I think things are more lively, more interactive, more on the internet. There's a lot of good stuff that's going to come out as far as learning is concerned and interaction that I think you're going to see with online learning coming up pretty soon. The writing is still fun. I'm still writing books. I mean, people always say, "Oh, so you're still writing books?" I'm like, "Yeah." Are you still reading them? And so, I have a book contract right now. I just finished 2 books, so I'm working on a third. And these are all updates. Actually, one was a new book, and then I want to update some other books because they go out of style. That version of PC for Dummies I showed earlier, that's 7 years old. So obviously, we need a new version of PCs for Dummies out there if people want to keep buying that book. So that's but it's always fun, and I'd love to do some self-publishing too, which is nice because it allows me to do shorter books. Maybe it's 100 pages long, as opposed to publishers who they want something that's 300 to 400 pages long, so it fits on the shelf and moves their competition away. So I can do some short little publishing things, which I have on Amazon Kindle. And I want to do some more of those too. I've just been really busy.
Have you thought about doing paperback editions of your self-publishing books as well?
Yeah, they are. I had them all printed out.
We said Amazon Kindle. I assume it's only going to be,
Yeah.
ebooks only.
So I did Dan Gookin's Guide to Curl Programming, Guide to N-Curses Programming, and Guide to XML and JSON Programming, these are all C programming things. And they were stuff that I was interested in. And then I'm like, I ought to, sorry, I'm off camera. So I thought, what, I just write this up and put it in. I want to do one on pointers for C, do one on network programming, and just, do these little quick things for people who want to stick to one topic. I tried to sell that to the publisher and they weren't interested. I said, we need to do like one topic books that are just really thin. They just cover one topic. You don't bother, padding it out to 600 pages. It's like, let's just get to the point, because that's what most programmers want to do. They don't want to sit down and read the history of things, which, as much as I love those other books that I have, a lot of them sit there and they say, back in 1962. And it's like, okay, I mean, I could read this back later when I really want to understand it. But right now I want to get my hands dirty. So.
No, it's funny because that's exactly the reason I got into self-publishing as well. Is because I wanted to talk about one particular topic very narrowly and then get it done. And, I also had the other, more insidious goal, which is like for a lot of children's books, especially when you used to grow up, there'll be a series. And then when you put the spine of the series on the shelf, they paint a picture across all of it. And so I was like, that's what I want to do. I want to basically, I don't know what the picture's going to be, but I want to have a series of really small books so that when you put them on the shelf next to each other, they'll paint a picture. And if you're someone who's like a completionist, you're going to be like, I don't care about the other 80 books you wrote, but I can't have this picture be incomplete. So I'm going to buy the other 80 just so I can satisfy my desire to have that all the way there. The publishers didn't find that interesting at all. And I don't even think they knew what I was even referring to. So I'm like, okay, I think I may not be like aware of like what they know about this, but they definitely understand like what it was then, like back then, like the 80s and 90s and so on. So
and you need a bookshelf for that too. So
you need a bookshelf, exactly. So I think my first book will be how to get a bookshelf, build it, or buy one.
What am I going to do with this?
And the second thing, like, what do you do with a bookshelf? Because clearly people have no idea anymore what to do with a bookshelf. But
well, I have tons of bookshelves. As a matter of fact, I'm the guy who has the books piled up on the table because there's not enough room on the bookshelf. So.
Oh man, but Dan, I feel like you and I can talk about this forever.
Sure. This would be great.
Yeah, no, it was great chatting with you, and yeah, I can't wait to see more of your books as they come out, and yeah, and continue to see how much other people will enjoy your content, for the many years to come as well.
Thank you very much, and I wish you the best of success. You're fun, and I think that's great. And thank you for using this platform to help spread the good word.
Anytime.